Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. I teach a lot of people how to cut dovetails, and the weakest skill I see is chiseling. So I'm going to give you a few minutes of tutoring on hopefully helping your chiseling skills. The first thing we need to do is get it sharp. Actually, the first thing we have to do is prepare it properly. The back needs to be flat. If the back isn't flat, the chisel is not going to be very predictable, and that's very difficult to try to work when you don't know where the blade is going to engage. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go, but let's come over here to the stones. It's a really simple process. I use two stones. Once the chisel has been prepared, I should say, I use two stones. I use a trend diamond plate, which has a 300 grit side and a 1000 grit side. And I finish my chisel, all my cutting edges actually, with a Shapton 16,000 grit. I use the 300 grit side of the trend to come in here. It only takes a few seconds to keep that finishing stone flat. I'll start my sharpening process on the 1000 grit side. Really simple. I don't need to polish the entire bevel, just the very leading edge. So I find the primary bevel, which on a chisel is going to be typically 25 degrees. Locate that. I keep both hands tied together, rise up off of it a few degrees. On narrow chisels, you'll find it's helpful if you just do little wee short forward and back strokes. If you try to do circular strokes like this, especially on narrow chisels, you'll end up skewing it often. And I'm going to do this until I can detect a slight burr on the back side of the blade. Usually 5 to 10 seconds is all it's going to take. As soon as I can feel a burr, I'm done over here. I'm going to jump over to the 16,000. I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm going to come up just a little bit higher so that I'm only touching the very leading edge of the chisel. Spend 5 or 6 seconds on that, and then flip it over. Always bring the handle down first, lay it on your stone, and then just a couple of seconds to remove any burr. That's all it is. Now, the nice thing about that is, and because my station is right there, I never have to have the excuse of working with a dull chisel. It starts to break down, I'm a minute away from having it brought back into pristine condition. Now, when you chisel, particularly as it applies to dovetails, you want to be able to see plumb. Now, what I mean by that, if you, in chiseling the waist between two pins, if you chisel and leave a bump in the middle, before you can get your joint to close properly, you're going to have to go in there and rework all of that area, and that's a ton of time. I'm actually going to start on the inside of the joint. Now, depending on how much material I have sitting on the waist side of my gauge line, I may come in and do a preliminary chop first. So that's a little bit too much. Any waste is going to put pressure on the bevel and try to drive the chisel back this way, and you don't want a divot. So what I'll do is come in, I get really close to the line, just a little chop like that. Now, when I put my chisel, and I tend to keep this hand with the mallet on the board, I use my thumb to kind of guide it, and I simply move the chisel back until it falls into the marking gauge line. Now, because I can see plumb, and if you need to, get a little square like this and just kind of give yourself a reference point. Find that, come in there, give it a couple of good whacks, don't be afraid to hit it, but by dragging it across like this, it'll find its spot when it drops into the gauge line, and then you know exactly where you need to be. Go down about halfway, flip that over. Now I've got a lot of material, a whole lot of excess material on the waist side, and I don't want that driving my chisel tip back, so I'm going to come in here, get about that close, and just a quick little tap. And what that does is it keeps the waist that is immediately ahead of the gauge line very small, so I can get in there and actually get that chisel down into the wood a bit before the extra waist starts to really build up pressure. But by the time it does that, there's enough support over here on this side of the gauge line supporting the chisel tip. There's no way it's going to get driven back. Now I'm over close to my pin, and that is sloped this way. So what I'm going to do first, if I'm not standing plumb, I want to be slightly undercut. Not a lot, not like this, just slightly. I'm going to give it a little whack to get it registered. Then I'm going to angle it forward, and I'm doing that because I want to be able to ride the slope of this pin. If I do, and I do it accurately, I can completely eliminate what would otherwise be another step during the clean-out process. Again, don't be afraid to hit it hard. And if you have to pry it to free it, always pry away from the gauge line. You never want to reference off of that line. That's going part of your finished joint. You want that nice and crisp. So holding the chisel in my left hand, using my thumb as a guide Just slide that across until it drops in. I'm up tight against this pin. Stand either plumb or slightly undercut. First one registers it, then I can angle it slightly. Now I've got a little bit left in the middle. Just clean out what's left. Now, I would have normally finished that other one, but for demonstration purposes, I'm not going to. Now, put that in the vise. I always work front to back. Now, when I'm doing this paring part, and that's a fairly hard cut going through that end grain, I'm going to hold the chisel securely with my left hand, and I'm going to brace it against the front of the workpiece. That way, I can push as hard as I need to back here with my right hand, but because I'm holding it firmly here and I'm braced against there, I'm not going to go sailing through and take a big chunk out of the back. But at the same time, I can still apply a lot of pressure, but very limited travel. So instead of trying to take a great big chunk out, just do it in small pieces. Then you don't have to apply as much effort. Now, when I get close like that, just pare that across, get rid of it. Same thing on this side. Now, I talked about being predictable. If the back is flat, you know that it's going to engage the wood when that flat back sits on the board. If it's not flat, and many times it isn't, and all you got to do to check it is look at the reflection in the back. If the reflection is severely distorted, you're almost guaranteed that it's going to be rounded over somewhat at the edge. And now when you come in here to try to pare, you're pushing, but you have to keep raising the chisel to finally find where it's going to engage. So much easier when you can do that just because you know your chisel back is flat. Get rid of any bump that might be sitting in there. I'm careful to stay away from this edge and that edge. And then as a final check, you want to take a small square like this, set it on there, and that needs to lay perfectly flat, and you should be able to move it side to side. And it's essentially referencing on the two outside edges. If it rocks at all, you've got a bump, and you're not going to be able to close your joint until you get rid of it because of that high spot. It's good to have a little 2-inch square like that in your apron because it comes in really handy when it comes to checking things like that. That's all there is to it. There's lots of uses for chisels, but this is the primary one that we go through. And if you just remember those, hold it in position so that you can see plumb. Keep it sharp. It takes seconds to get it back in the position you want it. And make sure in your initial preparation phase that you get that nice and flat, polish it up to whatever the highest grit stone that you're going to be using, and just work the very leading edge, what we call a micro bevel, so that you're not having to do a whole lot of excess work. If you're polishing all of this bevel, you're working on an area that will never touch the wood. You're wasting your time. One last little thing about the chisel itself. You want a little flat landing right here. You want relief on the sides. This is why it's called a beveled edge. But if that comes right to the edge, that's so sharp you'll cut yourself. You'll notice these IBC chisels have a little wee flat spot right there. It doesn't interfere when you're trying to get in between two tails. You've got to be able to get into that corner. It'll allow you to do that. At the same time, it'll protect you from having too sharp of an edge right there. Make sure you have good chisels too. Hope that helps.